I'd like to continue our discussion of joy from the Book of Joy, uh, taking a look at both the Christian and the Buddhist perspective on joy. One of the issues that, of course, many people speak about with regard to joy is, well, how can we be so joyful in in a world where there is so much suffering? We encounter suffering all over the place. How can we really be people of joy and embrace joy? Isn't this, in some ways, asking really too much of us to be people of joy? The Dalai Lama, from the Buddhist perspective, looks at it and says, well, look at the example of the Tibetans who survived in the gulags in China. Some were captured and taken to those prison camps in remote areas. And the Dalai Lama studies that situation and says, well, what enables some of them to survive? You might think, here they are in the most intense place of suffering, isolated from friends, isolated from family, remote locations, very little food, very difficult work, very cold conditions. How do you survive in that type of situation? Most people would collapse and really just withdraw into themselves and just maybe even give up in those type of horrid situations. And, talk about suffering. That's an intense form of suffering. So the Dalai Lama notes that and says, well, what helped them to survive? And he points out that those who survived had an inner spirit about them, had a sense of spirituality, had a sense of transcendence, which enabled them, each in their own way, to overcome the difficulties of suffering and focus on the spiritual, focus on the life within them that their captors could not take away. They could try to take away their human dignity, they could try to impose suffering, but there was something in the human spirit that no matter how hard the Chinese captors tried, they could not take away. And of course, we've seen similar stories in terms of the Holocaust and other terrible, awful situations throughout history and in modern times where people have had torture and extreme suffering, and yet, in the midst of that, they have been able to survive, and even some to experience this joy and to keep this joy alive within them in the midst of suffering. The Dalai Lama points to his own experience. He experienced great difficulties, for example, when the Chinese invaded Tibet. And as part of their invasion, they burned many of the Tibetan sacred books. Books that had been around for centuries were burned and destroyed. And they destroyed many of the sacred statues. The Dalai Lama himself had to leave secretly to get to India. And it's interesting as reflects on that whole experience of leaving his home, leaving so much of what he had experienced growing up, leaving that sacred area, which for him was so special in his life, and then having to have the humiliation of going in secret, going in disguise, because the fear was that he would be captured, of course. And so he went to India, which gave him safe harbor. But he said, in the midst of all that, he actually experienced greater joy. We hear that statement and we say, how is that possible? That in the midst of such intense suffering, such mental anguish and physical suffering, and such deprivation, leaving everything behind, that you could still experience great joy. And he said, really what it was the suffering. that going through that suffering, going through that deprivation, made me a better person, made me a stronger person, helped me to grow spiritually. And we reflect on that and say, wow, that's amazing that somehow going through that suffering could make one a better person. And I remember a story from my own ministry that always struck with me. One of the young men in our youth ministry died a very tragic death. He was only 16 years old and unfortunately fell off a truck. He was doing some landscaping and he died as a result of those injuries. A very horrific situation. I remember visiting him in the hospital and just feeling so much anguish for his mother and father and his sisters. Terrible situation. And the amazing thing to me was there was another family in the parish, and they had experienced a similar tragic situation with their son who died in an automobile accident. And the one thing that was able to console this family who had lost their son was when the other family came over and sat with them, visited, talked to them, explained what they had gone through, their own feelings, and it was amazing the difference that that made. It was because that couple had been through this terrible, horrific suffering that they were able to minister to others in suffering. And so the mystery of suffering is truly amazing. We don't know the lives that we can touch because of what we have experienced in a negative way in our lives. The Dalai Lama experienced a terrible, horrific situation, as a revered religious figure, going through all of that and the persecution, having to leave everything behind. And yet, because of that, he experienced an even deeper sense of joy in his life. And as we reflect on that and reflect on joy and its relationship to suffering, might there be something? Certainly no one invites suffering, no one wants suffering, but might there be something as a result of suffering that really helps us become stronger, better people, that helps us to become more compassionate, more loving? It seems mysterious in some ways, and I think the Dalai Lama, looking at it from a Buddhist perspective, embraced that suffering and through it achieved a even deeper level of joy. So maybe there is something about suffering that can lead us to become better people, more understanding people, and people even of a deeper joy.